further ado, let's get to the first question, which comes from David Stewart. And David was asking, hello, I'm working on my repertoire with the black pieces, and I realized that I don't see much 1d4 and 2c4. Sure, so I like the Queen's Gambit declined, which means I need to figure out something for the main lines. I have a good idea against the Catalan because I already played that as white, and I have d4, d5, c4, e6. Let me put that on the board. d4, d5, c4, e6, and we're going to be looking at this from black's point of view. Knight f3, knight f6, and knight c3, bishop b4. I'm comfortable playing for a Carlsbad in the exchange, so with like c takes d5, e takes d5, this structure with c6. But what are black's main plans after bishop to g5 on move 4? So for bishop g5, something like this, or perhaps white could also start with this one, and then black could play knight f6 here, and then white could play bishop g5 here, without trading on d5. So yeah, definitely a classic approach from white to develop the bishop out to g5, just setting up a simple pin, developing the bishop before developing the second bishop with e3 and not blocking in this one, you know, on the c1 square. So very, very natural for white to kind of develop this bishop early on and then try to play e3 and slowly get all the pieces out. So not much theory, right, that black has to know here. I'm just going to recommend like a really simple setup that I think lots of people can use, and I think this can last you a very, very long time. So if we want to play like a classic approach, I think the simplest would be to put the bishop on e7, and you can do this in, of course, many different variations. And from here, the plan is to castle and eventually fianchetto the other bishop, because this is really always going to be the main issue for black in a lot of queen pawn openings, is where to put the light squared bishop. The dark squared bishop, just based on the structure, is always going to be kind of a happy camper here, but the light squared bishop not so much. But black's idea is to just play b6 and fianchetto the bishop and eventually fight for the center with c5. And one way or another, the bishop on b7 will open up. Either white will take on d5 or black will just take on c4 at some point, and the bishop will have a nice open diagonal. So for example, let's say white just develops, or e3 here would be very, very similar. Castles, e3. A lot of players like to throw in h6, which I think is a very reasonable idea. You kind of put the question to white's bishop, and you ask if white wants to trade on f6 and give up the bishop immediately, or to back up with bishop to h4, and then kind of now giving black the option to play g5. Not that you should play g5 in this position. I think in general this is kind of a weakening move, but it's nice that you always have the option. But from here, I think black should continue with this plan of putting the bishop on b7, and then again playing for c5 and fighting for the center. So the knight can often go to d7 here, and then the rook can come to c8. But yeah, in general, black is trying to play c5. How much you prepare it really just depends on what white does here and what kind of moves they make. But in general, bishop b7, knight d7, c5. Black has, I think, a really, really healthy position. And yeah, in general, this is a very healthy setup that you can use against pretty much lots and lots of different setups that white can throw at you. This is a pretty classic and I think very, very playable development scheme for black. So yeah, one kind of interesting detail I want to mention is that at some point white might be tempted to take on d5, and how black recaptures on d5, this is always kind of typical strategic decision that black will have to figure out here. But a very common approach is to take with the knight to kind of encourage black, or encourage white to trade off more pieces, which kind of simplifies black's position. But also the idea is to kind of keep the diagonal open. So if bishop takes e7 here, for example, let's say knight takes e7, and then we want to put the bishop on b7, we're going to put the knight on d7, and then again we're playing for c5. So this pawn break, c7 to c5, regardless of how the structure changes, this is going to be like the main idea for black in this kind of position, which is kind of the main point I want to convey. Like without playing c5, then white is always kind of comfortable here because they have a little bit more space. But once black gets c5 in, then that's how black kind of equalizes in the center. Okay. Let's see here. So yeah, David, hopefully that answers your question. Obviously there's lots of different like moves that white can throw at you, but in general you're just following the all the typical principles of chess: developing, controlling the center, castling, fighting for the center, and then once you get into the middle game, well, it's all about still getting your pieces out, connecting your rooks, again fighting for the center. And yeah, very, very classic position. You know, lots of like you know, tons and tons of games in like the World Championships feature this kind of position. Like players like Capablanca, Alekhine, just like just so many world champions have played this kind of structures, either with white or with black. And yeah, a lot of classic games to study and look at from these positions. So you're definitely playing some very classic stuff. Is this the Tartakower variation? You know, I'm not fully up to date with what these lines are called. To me, it's just like a classic. I just just think of it as like a classic Queen's Gambit declined. But I have heard Tartakower thrown around, so that kind of makes sense. But yeah, I don't know for sure exactly. There was a question earlier. If white plays bishop g5 on move 4, does it matter at all which knight develops on move 3? I think it does kind of matter because black has more or less options. So for example, if let's say knight f3 and bishop g5, and let's say black played bishop b4 check, and then here white would have like a second option to go knight d2, which I think would be kind of an interesting move because then white is avoiding like these double pawns after knight c3 and future bishop takes c3. I mean, here we're essentially transposing to like Rogozin or Nimzo-Indian or whatever. But with knight d2, this is kind of a second option for white. But if black is just playing bishop e7, then it doesn't really make a huge difference. I think the knight is best placed on c3, and to put it on d2 would be, I think, a bit of a concession for white. So even this position, bishop b4 check knight d2, I mean, I think is totally acceptable for black. So yeah, but whether white plays like knight c3 or knight f3, I mean, of course, this comes up a lot for d4 players, and there are different lines where like, yeah, if black is playing like this kind of thing, and whether white has like knight f3 or knight c3, like here white has the option of like e4, which is pretty sharp, which they wouldn't have. But on the other hand, if you start with this one, then you have like queen c2, for example, for white, which is like considered you know, a very reasonable move that you wouldn't have if you developed the knight to c3. You'd have to do something else. So yeah, there are definitely lots of different lines, like according to that are based on like, yeah, whether white starts with knight f3 or knight c3. And it's definitely a big repertoire decision that d4 players have to make. Of course, the biggest decision is what to do in this position for white, right? Like this is kind of the classic this is the classic question. This will be a question, I think, for centuries. I don't think, if chess is solved, maybe one day we'll be able to answer this question, because of course here it's like the move knight c3 is kind of the most natural move, and it gives you the most flexibility as white against most everything that black can do. But it allows the Nimzo-Indian, which is pretty much just like one of the ultimate most solid openings, you know, unbeatable openings. And if white instead plays like knight f3, which avoids the Nimzo-Indian, because then white can put something on d2, well, then the knight is committed to f3, and now everything else is like, white is now committed with the knight to f3 here. White is now committed here. Can't play like the most aggressive lines, and so on. So yeah, it's a classic question, but I don't know. I mean, I've been playing d4 for many years. Eventually, you just end up playing both moves a lot and kind of get experience all over the place. Though I've mainly been a knight f3 player in recent years. Okay, let's go to the next question, which is from Kirk D, who says, "Tell me about the main idea of e4, e5." Let's put it on the board. Knight f3, knight f6. I think he means knight c6, d4 takes, knight takes d4, queen f6 to defend in the Scotch. Yeah, so this move, I remember I used to play the Scotch when I was really young, and I remember looking at lots of these like different lines. But yeah, I had to look this one up because I wasn't super familiar with kind of some of the points of playing queen f6 in this position. Of course, black has many different moves here. I think knight f6 is the most natural, the most popular. Bishop c5 is also very, very popular as well. This move, queen f6, it's kind of tricky. I think it's actually connected with a lot of the ideas behind playing bishop to c5 as well. So for example, if black plays bishop c5 here and white were to play knight takes c6, one of the ideas for black is to play queen f6 in this position, threatening mate in 1 on f2, which is always nice, forcing white to somehow defend against this threat, which is not that easy to do. White has to like either move the queen or play f3 or something, and then black can recapture the knight next move and claim that they kind of won a tempo and got white to weaken the position. Of course, this would be a total disaster for white. Bishop e3, because then the structure is weakened, and yeah, well, black can just play against these like weak pawns for forever. Anyway, I think the main move nowadays for white is to actually go queen f3, and then we get this kind of endgame where, you know, white is still kind of putting a little bit of pressure, but I think it's kind of overall solid for black. Anyway, so queen f6 is kind of similar to bishop c5 in that black is also kind of tempting white to play knight takes c6 so that they can play bishop to c5 here and kind of get this the same idea. The other thing is that black, with both of these moves, is trying to get white to play the move c3, because then this is taking away the very active square from the knight on b1. And then the queen on f6 actually feels a lot safer if the knight can't go to c3 and hit us with like knight d5 and stuff like that. So this is kind of the secondary idea, I believe, behind queen f6. In fact, like one of the main ways white can respond, I mean, I think the most natural move here for white is to just play knight to b3. But of course, there are other options as well. Knight f3 is pretty popular too, just putting the knight here. And then it's very interesting, and I think very crucial, that from black's point of view, the main move in the position is actually to go bishop to b4 check, which feels like kind of a beginner's move, because we're just allowing white to get a free tempo with c3. But then the point is, after bishop to c5, and a lot of players play like this, like some really, really strong players, black is now, again, taken away the c3 square from white's knight. And here I think, okay, black gets a reasonable position, like the knight will develop to e7, black will castle, queen can go to like g6 at some point, d6, all the pieces come out, maybe black can play for f5 one day, and yeah, seems like a reasonable position. Although my personal feeling on all these lines in the Scotch is that I never really love them from black's point of view. Like this line is always very popular, bishop c5, bishop e3, and then queen f6 here, inducing the move c3 once again. And playing for these lines. So this was really, really popular back in the day, and I mean, I think it's considered fine for black, but I never quite trusted it. I just always felt like the queen on f6 was going to be kind of a target one day, and yeah, to me, never looked fully healthy, although objectively I believe it's fully playable. So this is kind of similar. In fact, if queen f6, if white goes bishop e3, then I don't think black is anything better than just bishop c5, c3, and transposing back into this line. So in essence, the move queen f6 and bishop c5, these two moves, are actually pretty similar, and a lot of times they're just transposing mainly into, I would say, this line is kind of the more well-known move order. So queen f6 is just kind of another way of getting to this position, essentially, except a little bit differently. But yeah, essentially very, very similar. So if you're happy to play this position, this structure, then by all means it's perfectly reasonable. But if you're looking for like an alternative to the very popular bishop c5, then then queen f6 is like not a great choice, because in many lines black is nothing better than to just transpose back. And then I would suggest like knight f6 here, which of course allows white to go for this kind of very aggressive line. And not a lot of players, I think, or I should say not a ton of players enjoy playing this one as black. Although objectively, I think black is totally fine here. Like the classic line is to go queen e7 to pin the pawn, white goes queen e2, and now both queens are misplaced. But black's argument is that it's a little bit easier for them to like get this bishop out and target the e-pawn, and the knight now has a nice square on d5. And okay, so this is like considered the other super serious option for black in the Scotch. And basically that's kind of like the two main choices that black has to choose from. Either playing this position, which objectively totally fine, and if anything, I've always I don't want to say like I prefer black's chances here compared to white, but yeah, I've never really liked this from white's point of view, so it always felt a little odd to do this. So I was always kind of, this is what I used to play as black in the Scotch myself. But I can understand this isn't everyone's cup of tea, because it is kind of a weird position. Or black can go for bishop c5, these lines that are also not everyone's cup of tea, but I think are also objectively fine. And then black has like other lines as well that are a little bit, let's say like offbeat. Like I think bishop b4 check is a move here as well, with the idea as before of like inducing this move c3 and then pulling the bishop back. But I don't know. I mean, there's, yeah, a lot of these weird ideas. One thing I should note is that one advantage of this move queen f6 is that it does kind of avoid the line bishop c5, knight b3, which is pretty popular. This is actually one of the main ways that white can also fight against this line, is to play knight b3, knight c3, and then white looks to often play like very aggressively here, actually, with like queen e2, and like if knight f6, then bishop g5, or queen e2 first, and bishop g5, followed by queenside castling. And this line actually is pretty popular, and has become pretty popular over the last couple of years, so there's definitely a lot of venom here. So yeah, actually, if you're trying to avoid this exact line, but you're happy with other lines in bishop c5, then starting with queen f6 I think seems to make sense to me, because here either white is playing some other line, or if they play knight b3, obviously black is not playing bishop c5 and bishop b6 here. Although I don't exactly know how the theory continues here. I think queen g6 actually is the move. I was looking at this a little bit, hitting the pawn and then making way to develop the knight kind of normally to f6. And yeah, this line can be a little bit funky. For example, knight c3, here black plays bishop b4, and I think this is actually kind of annoying. Then like knight f6 and d5. And there's actually a very high level game between Shankland and Jeffrey Zhang, I think, with f3 here, with Shankland playing as white. And yeah, I was analyzing this a bit. That game continued knight f6, bishop f4, bishop b4 check, and king f2. Kind of a surprising move, but of course very definitely a concrete decision, because we saw a lot of lines earlier when black is trying to provoke c3. So here king f2 was played. I believe this was all prepared. Black castled, and now I think a3 here was the mistake. If white had played just like the direct bishop d3, then I think concretely computer stuff, white was better here. But after a3, bishop e7, bishop d3, here black had knight h5, which is very annoying. White took on c7, and then d6 was played, and yeah, it was just like a very, very messy position, but black was already seizing the initiative here with like bishop h4 check and stuff. You know, if g3, there would be like sacks and so on. So yeah, this is just to say there's a lot of wild positions that you can get out of the Scotch as black, so it really depends on how weird and how wacky of a position you want when you're kind of choosing a system to play here. Anyway, Kirk, hopefully that answers your questions about queen f6. It's kind of like a different way of reaching a lot of the same positions after bishop to c5, but avoiding certain lines, specifically knight to b3. And also, I think that's actually kind of the main thing. You're avoiding this line with bishop c5, knight b3, bishop to b6, but otherwise, essentially the lines are very similar. Okay, so that does it for the 2 questions I had. If people in the chat have other opening questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I'll just give you guys my quick thoughts. I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. But yeah, basically, we'll do my best. Okay, Countersparks asking for an active way to play against the Benko as white. That's a tough question. Yeah, Benko's a tough one because, right, it seems like the main approach nowadays is to take both pawns and try to use the extra pawn with this kind of classic setup, like knight f3, g3, king g2. But this isn't the most fun to play because, especially in blitz, it can be kind of tough to play against because black has all their typical ideas and all their typical counterplay, and then you have to defend and hold on to the extra pawn. And yeah, it's not everyone's not the most fun position. So yeah, I mean, I've played queen c2 here quite a bit. I don't know if I would call this like active, but it's similar in idea to knight f3 in that we're just kind of playing for the structure. So the idea is to play e4 here. Like if b takes e4, then white's going e4 and then winning back the pawn, and this would be like a very typical type of position that you might get out of this line. Say castles, and yeah, I mean, I think white is a little bit better here, and it's kind of like a Benoni, but black doesn't have this open a file, so strategically I definitely prefer white's position here. And yeah, it's not simple. I think it's very easy for black to quickly go wrong and fall into like a passive and bad Benoni position. And one idea is to go rook e1, tuck the bishop away on f1, maybe h3 here to control the g4 square, a4 somewhere. So to me, I've always felt this to be pretty pleasant, as a d4, c4 player. I would say the critical line maybe is for black to go e6 and then get this structure. Though most players, from what I've seen, they typically go for just kind of classic Benoni. But I think e6 is maybe objectively a little bit stronger. And then to play something like this, knight c3, and then bishop e7. g6, bishop g7, I think actually it's a typical blunder. I think is not great because of queen e2 check. Is very annoying. Or let's say like knight f3 first, and then queen e2 check, and then either black has to move the king, or they got to go queen e7, but then knight b5 is super uncomfortable because you're threatening to win the pawn, you're threatening to win the exchange. And so this is really awkward for black. And if they have to do something like take king d7, just already so I think concretely this is very, very dangerous. So that's why black just puts the bishop on e7, white goes knight g2, castles, and then the idea is to go like knight g3, bishop f4. And I think it's reasonable for white. Mamedyarov actually had some nice wins in this line where he puts the knight on g3, goes bishop f4, he targets this d6 pawn, plays knight e4 at some point, rook e1. And it's playable. I mean, I think objectively black is totally fine here, but it's definitely works as a surprise weapon, or if you just want something simple to play in blitz where it's not just black having all the fun, but you kind of know what you're doing as well. I think this is kind of reasonable. And if not queen c2, then, I mean, the next thing I would suggest is knight f3. I would say knight f3 is pretty similar in terms of what white is looking for. And like just kind of something interesting and playable. And if you're looking for something like really sharp and weird, then you can always play f3. f3 and e4 is always a good way to get something like super fun and aggressive. But I wouldn't say objectively it's the best way to go about it. Or you can, just take the pawn. Just take the pawn and a6, just take that pawn too, and just hold on to it. Just study some games and just learn how to like hold on to that pawn and make your opponent suffer. That's also possible. Okay, hopefully that helps. All right, next one from IMC Seahawks. Okay, can you look at e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, bishop f5, h4, h5, bishop g5, f6, bishop d3. Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know anything about this line. It looks pretty sharp, so, but I have no idea what's going on here. Looks like white is offering a piece sacrifice. And I guess this would be my first question here is e6 the idea? Not even sure. But yeah, looks like a very sharp line. I would recommend analyzing this one with the almighty Stockfish, because Stockfish is super strong and can help you in these sharp positions. Or if there's already games played here between humans, I would recommend looking at those games as well and trying to get a sense of what's going on here exactly. Because I don't... So yeah, so what is the idea? Okay, so check followed by e6. Okay, and then king runs to like c8. And then we're going like hg5, I assume, to just kind of like trap the knight and everything. Oh, Jesse gives this line. Oh, cool. Okay, yeah, I don't know if you're in the training program, but I guess Jesse has this line in his aggressive repertoire. Yeah, it looks very interesting. I mean, just at first glance, if black wasn't prepared for this, I think this would be extremely unpleasant to face. Yeah, I mean, just like it just looks. I mean, you can't move any of your pieces. That's yeah. Oh wow, so you're not in the program, so you knew about the line independently. That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know if this is like a well-known thing or what, but I haven't really. Yeah, I've never taken a close look. Cartier says knight h6 is best here, just to give the piece back immediately. That is a very human thing to do, is to just give the piece back in order to try and solve your problems. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely exactly the kind of position where I would think a practical game is gonna be really useful, just to see how things might progress from here, because it's a very complicated position. And I mean, I guess f6 here isn't exactly the main move, right? Black has like queen b6 and stuff like this as well, or I'm not sure what the main line is, but yeah, definitely this feels like one that would be good to spar and practice and see how it plays out. Problem is no one plays f6. Yeah, to me f6 strikes me as kind of asking for it. Like, yeah, even if white doesn't go bishop d3, it's just like, yeah, weakening move, right? But yeah, nice idea to have in the pocket. Okay. Let's get back to questions. Recommendation versus bishop c5, knight c6 in the Scotch. I mean, I don't have like specific recommendations there because I don't really play the stuff that much these days. I believe Queen F6 here is the main move that most of the top players are playing. Hitting this one before recapturing the knight. So if white goes like F3 or something, then you take back. Or maybe there's some cases where you go DC, but I think normally you want to take towards the center, eventually playing for D5, 97 castles. So I think this is kind of the idea that a lot of players go for, just winning a tempo here, and then if white does something like Queen E2, then okay, you say like, well, your queen looks funny on E2. That would be kind of the idea. Okay. What about Saemisch King's Indian? Best way to play against knight e2, knight g3. Yeah. Actually, I've been working on the King's Indian repertoire a lot. Actually, on the Saemisch, quite a bit this week. For the dojo training program that already has access to the King's Indian stuff as I release it on a infrequent basis. Okay, so knight e2 here. Definitely interesting move. I played this one as white actually a lot. So I think this line is kind of pretty fun for black. C5 playing like Benoni style I think is very playable as well. But A6 I think is a little bit more fun with the idea to sack a pawn with B5. So there's a lot of games here lately and looks like, I mean, totally fun. I mean, I think a lot of players still aren't familiar about this one, and yeah, the nice thing is that if white doesn't accept the pawn, then it's like, I think you just get b4, and it's very annoying for white to have to to have to deal with this. Then you can fight for the center, e5, c5, whatever you want. So yeah, I would say definitely check this one out. The move order can kind of depend, like bishop b3. Some players start with knight d7. Some players play b5 first. I think both moves are playable, but you can start with knight d7, queen d2, and then go b5, or you can go b5 right away, and it's very similar. And the idea here is that if white takes the pawn, black is going c6. White has to bring the knight back, and then black is just trying to blow everything open. So you can go knight d7 here, and then e5, d5, and just opening up the center, rook e8, rook b8, and just putting maximum pressure, kind of playing like it's like a interesting version of the Benko, where we have like the open queen side, but also like white is very, very behind in developing the king side. And so by the time white is finished developing their pieces, we're already going e5, d5, and blasting everything open. So this is I think pretty fun for black. Oh, there's a St. Louis Chess Club video from Daro on this idea. Okay, I mean, yeah, he's that sounds like worth watching. Yeah, against bishop e3, I think this idea is not as strong. Not sure exactly why, but I think if white isn't committing knight e2, then after like queen d2, well, here it's not as good to play b5 with the bishop open. Like you need the knight on e2. And so you can like try to wait with like knight d7, and then if knight e2, b5, then I think this is totally okay. But white has other moves here. They can go like h4, they can castle. So this is kind of, I think, still pretty risky for black, and a little bit different. Yeah, yeah, it's fun when you like learn a new idea, and then you start playing in some games, and for sure. Um, okay. All right. Question from AFCKN problem. They're 1100, so not doing openings per the program. Shout out Dojo Training Program. But you saw that the French is in the list at 1200. You're under the impression that people think the French is boring. Yeah, so yeah, just to be clear on that, the openings we offer, like in the program, like you don't have to play them. It's just if you want to, those repertoires are available. So yeah, by no means do you have to play the French or the King's Indian or anything. Like you can play any openings you want. But yeah, if you do play those openings, then there's like repertoires there and that we're slowly building out, and we're hopefully gonna like eventually the plan is to have multiple opening repertoires available for different stuff. Like I want to do like a Sicilian repertoire, e4, e5, you know, etc. But yeah, you don't have to play anything that you don't want to play. I mean, we all believe that like you should choose your own openings and play the stuff that you believe in, and whether that's the French, Sicilian, e4, e5, Caro Kann, like whatever you want to do, as long as it like has a name and makes sense, is it's totally fine, according to us. So the French is by no means mandatory. I mean, I'm against the French. I don't think playing the French is a good idea, unless like you really like it. Like some players, I think, are just born to be French players. I think Jesse might be one of them. And, you know, some very strong GMs that just played the French their whole life, like Korchnoi. You know, he's definitely one of them. But I don't think it's for everybody. The Sicilian repertoire would it be 2e6? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I like the Sveshnikov. I don't I don't know. Najdorf is fun. Taimanov Sicilian with 2e6 is also not bad. I don't know. Probably if I was to recommend something, I'd probably recommend the Najdorf. Yeah. Maybe we should ask David to develop a Najdorf repertoire, but because he's the real Najdorf player among us. He played the Najdorf for a long time. Okay. Scrolling back up for more questions. Okay, Foos Chess asking about knight f3. So knight f3, f5, d3. Yeah, this line I think can be kind of fun for white. Knight f6, e4. Oh, so you're asking about d5. About 3d4. Wow, so whether this is playable. I don't hate it, I'll tell you that much. I don't hate it. Like, if I had to choose a side, I would take white. Because I do feel like f5, I mean, it's just like a long-term weakness that black is committing to. So it's very risky strategically. So, yeah, I would already take white here for sure. Yeah, and I'm just curious, because I just wanted to confirm. Yeah, Engine thinks white is better in this position, which is not surprising. That's one of the I think maybe lesser known innovations of the engine is that it has many positions, or is like it shows many positions where it's just like it just evaluates the position as good for one side or the other. So it doesn't matter if you like lose a tempo or you lose two tempo. It's like as long as it's the same position, it still likes it for white as long as it's the same structure essentially, which is very very interesting. You know, technically engines are supposed to be super concrete, but sometimes they understand like, okay, you lose a full tempo, it doesn't matter. It's like the long-term weaknesses are long-term weaknesses. Yeah, this looks very nice to me for white. Right. Yeah, yeah, classic game selector, John. Yeah, yeah, I think it really makes an impression. It seems logical. It seems like there's other moves here as well, but to me, d4, I mean, it's also so like, it's such a powerful, such a powerful thing to do to your opponent. It's so brutal too. Actually, there was a famous Magnus game. I think Carlsen against uh, Dolmatov. That went something like this. It was like knight f6. I think it was e4, d6, knight c3. I think this is how it went. e5, and then Magnus took. Bishop takes, and he goes d4. So again, yeah, losing the tempo. But the point is that white is just breaking up the center because black has already weakened their king side. And so if the stuff gets traded off, like black's king is never going to be weak like all these diagonals. And then if e4, then knight h4, and this is also kind of just like unpleasant for black because white will go like f3 and then queen takes f3, bishop c4, and castle, and white just develops super actively, or something like this. But anyway, yeah, this Carlsen Dolmatov game definitely worth looking up. Anyway, yeah, there's also a line because I used to play the French, and I remember this is a move people would sometimes play. Queen e2. And the idea, I mean, is just to play King's Indian attack with d3, knight d2, g3, just King's Indian attack, but just starting with a different move order. The queen is often going to e2, but discouraging black from playing the #1 French move d5. Because here, okay, white can take, and then you got to take with the queen, and now, you're just losing time, and this isn't fun for black. But yeah, I remember learning that like one of the best moves for black in this position is just to go e6, e5. And yeah, why not? Yeah, no, exactly. And actually I had a game like this that went knight f3, knight c6, c3, so playing the Ponziani with extra tempo queen e2. And against the Ponziani, main move is d5, fighting for the center. And then one of the main moves for white in that position is bishop to b5. But here, since he puts queens on e2, that's not possible. So he played queen b5 instead. I swear, this is a game I had as black. Against actually a very strong grandmaster. It was a very interesting game. It wasn't like, because it's kind of annoying. If de, there's knight e5. But yeah, but it ended up, we ended up drawing the game. Yeah, and it also makes sense because in the Ponziani, when the queen is on d1, another main move is queen a4. So it's kind of combining ideas with bishop e5 and queen a4. Okay. Let's see, other questions? How would I counter the Smith-Morra with black? Yeah. Well, I think against the Smith-Morra, the cool thing you can do is you can essentially treat it like a c3 Sicilian, right? So if you think about the c3 Sicilian, white goes c3, black makes some move. Let's say knight f6 here attacking the pawn, white pushes e5, knight d5, white goes d4, black takes. And then we end up getting this structure, which is very playable. White has more space, but black has a very nice square on d5 for the knight, and then can get a lot of play against white's advanced pawn on e5 with the move d6, the knight d7, queen c7, and so on. So this is already a line that I play against the Sicilian. So against the Smith-Morra, it actually just makes a lot of sense to try and transpose into that. So here after c3, black can go knight f6, hitting the pawn. If white takes on d4, then we're just taking this one, and it's just an extra pawn for black. I think we're very happy. If white takes with the queen, then they're playing with the queen, and we can just develop our pieces, go d5 next, and I think, again, black is very, very happy here as well. So white pretty much has to go e5. And then after knight d5, white doesn't really have anything better than to just take the pawn and transpose back into this position that we're already comfortable to play as black with e6 and d6. Or white can start with knight f3 first, keeping the pin alive, taking advantage of the fact that we can't take here because queen takes d5 would be a free piece. But here it doesn't really change anything for black. We can just go e6 and then d6 and eventually we're just getting the same thing. So yeah, I never felt a reason to go into the Smith-Morra. Now, there is a bit of a difference if you're playing d5 here, and then going into this line. In this position, you don't really want to go c takes d4 too quickly as black, because then white can take with the pawn, and they get the nice c3 square for their knight. This is still totally playable, but it's not ideal, and so a lot of players keep this pawn on c5, and they don't trade until white has moved the knight, which makes sense, so that the knight doesn't get to c3. So much more popular here is knight c6 or knight f6, and objectively better. So if white starts with d4, you take c3, and then you go d5 here. And this is a little bit of a worse version, right? Because takes, cd4, and then it's as if you've already committed to taking. But yeah, for me, I mean, I've never been a d5 player. I've always been more of a knight f6 player. Oops. So that hasn't really been an issue for me. Yeah, if you are playing d5, I don't think it's a huge deal. I think, especially for most players, like, I think this is still a very, very reasonable position. So let's say here, knight f3, maybe bishop g4, knight f6, e6, you can just develop it. Yeah, I think it's quite reasonable for black. But I like knight f6. I would anyway recommend the knight f6 lines. What to do in that line? Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. Let's say it was this one, right? Yeah, I think sometimes the queen goes to d6 here, sometimes to d8. It kind of depends. I don't, 100% know about this line because, again, I'm more of a knight f6 player, but yeah, typically, or I don't know, actually, some lines you have to be careful because there's like d5. So this might be here. I don't know, maybe we gotta take on f3 here. So maybe this is an option with the bishop already on g4. Yeah, maybe this one is too aggressive. Maybe more solid is like here. I'm really not familiar with these lines, but something like this. And then this is, I think, maybe like the most solid approach. e6, knight c6, bishop e7, castles. But yeah, then just playing against the isolated queen pawn, eventually trying to develop the bishop. Oh, what to do if you have to accept the Smith-Morra? Well, if you got to accept it, all right. I mean, it's just training, right? So that's fine. Let's see. I think a very typical setup is to play like a Scheveningen with e6 and d6. Yeah, it's not going to be fun. It's also not very fair. You're essentially just going to be like a punching bag for your friend, which is fine, but just know that that's kind of what it's going to be, what it's going to feel like. Because it's like this isn't how you would treat the gambit, right? So it's not like you guys are playing. It's just your friend asking like, hey, can you step into my territory and we can play a position that like I'm super familiar with. And so it's like, all right, well, it's, it's gonna be tough. It's gonna be tough. Nice. Nice. Yeah, I saw Eli had a good course that caused a lot of controversy. Seemed like people were really threatened by the course. Um, let's see. Don't think I missed any questions, so that's cool. So we're done with the opening lap, so we can get the music back on. Yeah, well, he does have these tricky move orders, like here, and then let's say you go d6, d4 takes c3. But then I would think yeah, we'll often have options like this, right? Here, like knight f6 looks pretty annoying for white. And then you're just ready to take the... So I guess it kind of depends on what Sicilian black plays. I think I would get this sometimes as a Taimanov player, and then I would just go knight f6 here. Although you could take the pawn. I mean, you can. It's just like, I don't know. It just doesn't seem. Well, the point is like I've already studied this position quite a bit, so I might as well just play into it since I'm already willing to play it. So, yeah, no real need to have to go into someone else's territory. Right. There's also this queen d4 line, which, I mean, it's weird. It's tricky, but it's kind of weird. Yeah, yeah. Of course, e5 is definitely one of the most common, like biggest moves. We always have to figure out in the Sicilian. Sometimes it's very good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's just like normal. Like here, it's like just kind of fine. It's like it's not killing black, but it's not the horrible weakness for white. It's just balanced. But in other positions, like this e5 move can just be absolutely crushing, and then some position can just be like a huge mistake and like total weakening move. But that's what makes the Sicilian so cool. It's like so dynamic. There's so many different ideas and variations, and not variations in terms of like opening lines, but just like possibilities. Just so many different themes, and yeah. Right. You mean if you already have d6 in and then they go e5, whether you should take or... Yeah. Yeah, that can be hard to say as well. Sveshnikov question. Yeah. I think Sveshnikov players sometimes do suffer with some of the move orders. So knight c3, knight f6, knight f3. Yeah, so for this one, I mean, I know a lot of players will play e5 here, and this is what Magnus would do when he's playing his Sveshnikov repertoire. I mean, this leads to a very specific kind of position, like white goes bishop c4 and d3. But it's very, very playable. Magnus had some nice games here. He had a very nice one against Svidler. There's different setups, like with bishop e7, and then you can also go like h6, g6, bishop g7. So this, I think, is one way that Sveshnikov players typically handle this. Because it's not fun if you have to do something like e6 and then d4 and you're playing like Taimanov Sicilian. And knight f6 here, I think, is not sure what's. I think there's other lines here, but like e5, for example, you have to be aware of, and bishop b5 as well, also, because now you maybe can't go like g6 and knight f6 is not what you would normally do here. And I think knight e2 is also kind of a question. because here white could be playing d4. But I think this is more of a question for Najdorf players. Like if you're a Najdorf player and you're going d6 here, then after d4, it's like, oh, no, there's no Najdorf. Although, like, let's say you would play like this. And then, yeah, if you're a Najdorf player, maybe you go knight f6 here. So, yeah, depending on the Sicilian, you always have to be very careful with your move orders and how you're dealing with like the close Sicilian and these like knight e2 move orders. So one thing I always liked about the Taimanov is that with e6, you're pretty much fine. There's actually this is a good setup against all like the sidelines, like the Grand Prix attack, close Sicilian. Like I think the e6 setups are quite nice, and then it's always easy to transpose back into whatever you need in case white goes for d4. How much time do I think is needed to be somewhat comfortable with the new opening? It's hard to say. I don't know. I mean, for me, it definitely takes me multiple games before I feel at least somewhat comfortable. So I do try to play a lot of like training games when I'm learning a new opening, and I essentially just try to play like a couple games in every like major variation. So like for the King's Indian, I was trying to play a lot of training games and like the different lines, and same as Sicilian. So yeah, I think it takes at least like, I don't know. It's hard to say, but like several months, right? It would be my guess around there before you start to feel used to it. If we're talking about like a new opening, like as black, like a major opening. If we're playing like just some random line as white, then maybe it doesn't take that long to get a handle of it. But like you can play a couple of games and get used to it. But if we're talking about like playing like a whole Sicilian or playing Caro Kann or something like that, then I feel like it takes a couple months to really get used to it. Yeah, yeah. E4 is tough. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Oh, oops. That's d4. E4 is fun though. You get to develop your pieces, go for the attack, checkmate. Who doesn't like checkmate? The word of the day. Checkmate. Yeah, actually, Dax, that's one of the funny things about like I did a Sicilian speed run, and I think I played a Najdorf for the Open Sicilians, and I'm saying I think because like Yeah, I genuinely don't remember. Actually, no, I play. I don't even remember. I played a Sveshnikov, but I got Open Sicilian like only a handful of games, all the way up to like 2200. Most games were just either Smith-Morra or C3 Sicilian or Grand Prix attack or close Sicilian, or a lot of bishop c4s. And yeah, just like just a couple of Open Sicilians. So yeah, it's funny. It's like this standoff, because both sides are terrified of the theory. A lot of people don't want to play the Sicilian because it's like, oh, it's too much theory, I'm gonna get wrecked. And then a lot of people don't play into the Open Sicilian because it's too much theory, they're gonna get wrecked. So yeah, a lot of people are avoiding the Sicilian because they're afraid of the other side knowing theory. Yeah. It's a weird thing because it's I think maybe this is part of the what's going on. If you look at like tournament chess though, if you play the Sicilian and you're playing in like open events or these closed norm events, you're gonna get a lot of Open Sicilian. You're gonna get a couple Open Sicilians like every tournament if you're facing e4 players. So if you're like a tournament player, especially at a higher level, then you will be facing the Open Sicilian quite a lot, and it's very very critical, so it's a very important thing to study. But yeah, at like sub 2000 level, then yeah, you're not really seeing the Open Sicilian that much, because a lot of people are afraid of all the different lines they have to learn, and so they're just learning sidelines themselves. And so then as a Sicilian player, you just have to deal with the sidelines. But for me, that's a reason to play the Sicilian, because all the sidelines I think are just comfortable for black. I just think like black gets great play. So that's why, I don't know, I've always kind of preferred the Sicilian to like e4 e5, for example. With e4 e5 you have the main lines like the Ruy Lopez and the Italian that are like very serious, but also like the sidelines are kind of annoying to deal with. Like you got to deal with the four knights. You have to deal with like all the gambits, like Evans Gambit, King's Gambit, and these can be kind of like tricky to face, like Vienna, all this stuff. But in the Sicilian, all the sidelines, I don't know, I just think like black just gets equal play from the opening, and there's no dangerous gambits really. Scotch Gambit is also kind of annoying, yeah, for e4 e5 players, but for the Sicilian, like there's no gambit that's actually annoying. Smith-Morra I think is annoying, but you don't have to go into it. You can just play C3 Sicilian. So, and C3 Sicilian, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, some players don't like facing it, so I think it's a matter of taste, of course. I'm not saying this for everybody, but for me, it's like I've always been happy to see it. But yeah. But then, yeah, a lot of people, when they study the Sicilian, they're like focused on all the Open Sicilians, and they're like, oh, I'm never going to remember this. But then, yeah, I mean, it might not be necessary because like you're rarely going to get tested anyway. Oh yeah, definitely pumpkin. I mean, Sicilian is my main repertoire usually. Yeah. Now, what I am saying mainly, I'm just talking about like classical chess. I think in blitz chess, all the opening stuff kind of goes out the window, and then it really just depends. Because yeah, there are lots of really strong players that like just play like the C3 Sicilian, for example, and it's a very good like blitz weapon for them because you don't have a lot of time, and you're just, if you're familiar with the ideas in a line, then anything can be good. So it's a totally different story in like blitz and rapid. And that's another thing people often do. It's like they decide their openings for classical chess based on their blitz results. so they play some opening they've never played before in blitz. They lose a couple games and they're like, oh, I guess this opening is bad because like I'm losing, these blitz games. So I guess it's not me. I guess it's just the opening is bad. So, yeah. What I think of the Trompasco 3 Knight D2, that's a good line. I named that line the Tromp wall attack because it's like a Trompowski, but also you're trying to build a Stonewall. Tromp wall. I had a video on it.